And we're back with Jon Hodges for round two. Jon, thank you for coming back on. For people that haven't listened to episode 156, Jon was on discussing all things hip arthroscopy. Today is going to be a little bit of a different topic. Jon, for people who didn't listen to that first episode and maybe aren't familiar with you or Nev PT, can you just tell people who you are and what you do?
Yeah, totally. My name's Jon Hodges. I'm one of the owners of Nevada Physical Therapy, based out of Reno, Nevada, and we have 3 locations here that primarily works with the sports orthopedic setting, but also like Gen Pop. So we cover a pretty wide ground. My clinic specifically kind of focuses on return to sport testing and research. So it's definitely where my passions are. And yeah, with the hip scope protocol, I mean that was obviously a big research dive, and we'll have a lot of that in this one too, but definitely a twist talking about your own stuff. So
Yeah, before we dive into it, you did a deep dive in hip arthroscopy, and that's what we talked about last time. And that protocol and some of the, I guess, template for going through that process is on the website. There's also one for rotator cuff repairs for ACL. And then you have, I think, is it a separate website for the ACL project? Do you want to touch on what that is?
yeah, so the aclproject.com is just kind of a standalone website. It's obviously like underneath our umbrella, but really we specialize so much in ACL rehab that I needed an easier way to kind of get information out there, and just for my own like kind of brain process of a way to kind of have a target place to kind of put things instead of getting lost in like the depths of just a parent website. So it is Nevada PT, but it's just kind of our own standalone resource for people that are looking for just an easy way to find ACL content. There's sample templates. There's our own obviously like kind of protocols and some of our own stuff on there. So yeah, it's just hopefully a little bit more concise resource for folks.
Yeah, we'll plug that resource as well in the show notes for people to dive into. And that's the topic we're going to be talking about today: ACLs and some meniscus and just the whole knee rehab process. Jon, tell us what happened to yourself. Today's going to be kind of a personal story, and then how this evolved into you diving more into the research and probably guiding future care with other patients. We've had, when this episode comes out, we would have just had a second episode with Rula Katsufaki on timelines for ACL. We had a previous episode with Eric more recently on early stage ACL. We've had a host of guests within the past few months and years discussing this, but this is going to be kind of a personal experience and also big picture. How does this guide management? But what happened, and just outline the story.
Yeah. I mean, they're never cool stories. You know what I mean? So I was painting my house. So it was a little project I was working on for a couple weeks, and I was trying to get it done before the winter. So kind of mid to late November. And as it always goes, it was the last 10 feet that I had to paint of my house. And so it was a weird spot where I had to get my ladder. So you can always look back on like how injuries, happen, and if I could have done something different. So this section of my house is where a lot of my landscape was. So my ladder can only fit in, certain areas. So you may not know this, but I'm not a very tall individual. So I was in a weird spot and just kind of overreaching to try to get to the corner, so I didn't have to move my ladder, of course. And something they don't tell you about ladder injuries is they happen slowly. I'm reaching and I can just kind of start feeling it. And the ladder fell like very slowly. And I remember just being like, no, 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 no. And then a lot of F words. So I landed on my feet, very athletic, very proud of that. Except when I landed, I took 100% of my body weight into my right knee, and just like I'd been shot. Like I crumpled immediately. I'm in the bushes, super intense. Like the pain was like probably like, top 2 pain experiences that I've had. And I'm not a stranger to this, right? This is my third ACL injury. So by far the most painful one. So after about, 10, 15 minutes of laying in the bushes, I got myself up and wanted to make sure I didn't fracture anything. Anything was broken. So I was able to put some weight on it, and felt confident, like, all right, nothing, is too broken here. And, got out of the bushes and was walking to my front door, and my knee just totally like, buckled again. So that was like kind of like, that's not good. Sat on my porch for a few minutes and just kind of did some deep breathing and hobbled my way inside. And, my wife told my wife what happened. And she's very, protective and motherly. And she's like, we got to go to the hospital right now. I'm like, nothing's broken. She's like, we need to get an MRI. Well, there's nothing to do. Like, there's nothing, like, let's just let it calm down. And so it was super swollen. First week and a half, I was on crutches so it was about 10 days. And then kind of start weaning off crutches, and it was still pretty rough, but I didn't miss any work. I was able to I think I missed maybe one day. And over the course of like 2 weeks, I started to kind of feel more confident that it was improving. Right. So I said, I'm going to give this a couple weeks and just kind of see, what happens. And I made, pretty consistent improvement until about the 4 week mark. I was able to get around the bike, but it kind of always hurt. I couldn't kneel, couldn't lunge, couldn't squat, and that never really improved. And so I kind of got to a lot of improvement, and then I got stuck at a spot. So I was like, all right, my wife and I had a deal that, if by 4 weeks, it wasn't, significantly improving, I'd get an MRI. So got an MRI pretty quickly, and MRI showed a full ACL rupture, which I was actually surprised because I had an ACL tear back in PT school, actually, on this knee. I had the repair, went through, kind of like a mediocre rehab process, never finished it, it was underwhelming, which is one of the reasons why we specialize in it now, because it was just such a terrible experience for me. But we have a KT 1000, so we can actually do, laxity measurements. And that knee was always lax, so both knees. Average, KT for a male is probably gonna be somewhere between 3 to 6 or 7 millimeters. And I was 14 on one knee and 17 millimeters on the other. So I was always really well outside of like the norms for laxity. So when I saw that on the MRI, I was actually pretty surprised that I had an ACL 2 rupture. So I think I had an endpoint, but it wasn't physiologically doing anything. But so ruptured my ACL, tore my MCL, which I knew because I had a lot of bruising along the medial part of my knee. And then I tore the medial meniscus root, and I had a non-displaced tibial plateau fracture and a lateral femoral condyle fracture. So I essentially had about 2 structures that I did not severely injure based on that MRI. So there you go.
Yeah. So you get these MRI reports. The immediate next thoughts, or when you're hearing this, what are you assuming is going to occur from an operative standpoint? Do you have any thoughts going through your head? Or are you just immediately discussing this with the surgeon and they're kind of giving you options? What did that look like?
Yeah. So I think, in our field, this is the big disconnect between, I think, patients and the general population and PTs is pretty unusual to see something on an MRI that you're like, that needs to be intervened on. You know what I mean? Like, that is not, it's just a small percentage thing that, in the reality of like MRI findings. So when I saw that I had a root tear, I knew I was getting surgery. That wasn't one of those things that I was willing to try to conservatively manage. And we can talk more about that too. But that was one of those findings that I'm like, I'm getting surgery. So we went through that, I made that decision, and my surgeon actually was like, let's do the ACL too. But because I'd been ACL deficient for so long, I was really kind of like, I've never really had a functioning ACL. Like, I don't see the point. And he just kind of convinced me to do it. He's like, we're already in there. You'll be pissed if down the road, you have instability, because you may have been high functioning with laxity because maybe you had endpoint or whatever it was. But also the ACL and the meniscus root are pretty dependent on each other, right? So that medial meniscus root is more of like a curb, and so he thinks that actually one of the main reasons why I might have torn that root was because I did have laxity, that I didn't have that stop, and so it just kind of tore. So I got bullied into getting my ACL done, but I am excited because this is the first time in my adult life that I might actually have a ACL sufficient knee. So it's exciting, but yeah, so that's kind of where we went with that.
Congrats. The decision for type of graft, autograft, allograft, how did that go? What'd that look like?
Yeah, so I didn't want to do it to begin with. So, and I'm running out of tendons, to harvest. And so that was the concession. He's like, hey, let's just do a cadaver graft, you know what I mean? And the quad tendon graft is a better graft. So he decided to use that one, or we decided, it was just going to be an easier recovery. There was no real point of me doing, and autograft because I'm 43 and all I like to do is lift weights and, you know, snowboard. So I'm just not one of those guys that needs to have like a sufficient, ACL.
And you alluded to the fact that because you knew there was a meniscal root tear, that you thought this was going to be kind of a candidate for surgery. Why is that? Can you touch on what you just knew going into that, and then how that understanding has now evolved as you've dived more into the research?
Yeah. So the the meniscus root obviously is like the anchor, right, for the meniscus. So, and depending on how you can probably debate the research on these things, but the current understanding is that when you disrupt the meniscus root, you lose the ability to distribute force from the femoral condyle through the meniscus, right? And so the meniscus root tear is unique because it is biomechanically equivalent to having no meniscus at all, right? So I mean that joint force goes directly to the tibial, plateau, and so biomechanically it's just different than other types of injuries, right? If again, you can probably get into the weeds on the research on the biomechanics and how they come up with this, but that is the current understanding, is that the force distribution that happens after a meniscus root tear is the equivalent of not having meniscus at all. So that's the conversion into total knee replacements and these kind of really like rapidly progressing osteoarthritic type cascades was pretty high. So yeah, I was definitely getting the root repair. ACL was just kind of a throw in, and that's where we went.
Yeah, got it. So you, from this, started chipping away at some of the research on what does this now look like as I rehab this? What can I expect? What are the weight bearing? Is that what started you looking down further into the research on meniscal root repairs?
Yeah, I mean, well, and before we even get there, like, which I didn't mention, is there was a surprise lateral root tear, right? So actually, the MRI didn't pick that up, but when he was in there, he's like, "You actually tore the lateral meniscus root also." And ironically, as a PT, I've never seen anybody that's torn both meniscus roots, and so it's just a super. Not only is it just like a pretty rough injury, but the one that I had is pretty rare. Like you just don't see those very often. We'll talk about that too with the research side, but they're just different populations that get medial root tears versus lateral root tears. So yeah, he my surgeon gave me his weight bearing protocol, which was it was basically 2 weeks of toe touch weight bearing, and then you could weight bear as tolerated in a locked extension brace. So he was really more protective on the loaded knee flexion versus the actual like kind of axial loading. There's another, and I have a patient that was really right at that same time. His surgeon was 6 weeks non-weight bearing, right? So there was a big discrepancy between the protocols that the one that I got, and my surgeon is progressive, and we're obviously really good friends. I mean, so even when we were having these conversations, like, well, what do you think? You know what I mean? Like we were able to kind of collaborate and talk a fair bit. But when I was comparing to some of the other protocols that some of the other surgeons in town were doing, again, there was just a wide variety, right? I mean, all the way from his probably being the more progressive to these other guys that were literally non-weight bearing for 6 weeks. And so that kind of got me digging into where did these weight bearing precautions come? And I thought it was going to be a similar experience to when I did weight bearing precautions on the hip protocol, right? I mean, which was there's a couple of papers. There's like 3 papers that were published that were really pretty well done and they were pretty compelling. That was like, hey, we actually don't see any adverse events or poor outcomes if you weight bear as tolerated for hip scopes. But what ended up happening is there was, because if the complications, like if this fails, right, we're talking about the biomechanical equivalent of not having a meniscus root. So there's a little bit more of a risk here. So I was just kind of nervous about it. Even being a PT, when it's yourself, you just kind of, you get in your own head, too much, right? And so you just kind of get stuck in these like dark corners of I hope this doesn't fail. So I had to feel really confident. This is just typically how I process things. Is I have to read every single thing that's ever been published, and I have to go through like back to the origin stories of where this stuff came from. So with the meniscus root weight bearing protocols, it really, we've only been doing these for 20 something years, right? I mean, it's still pretty in the infancy of orthopedic surgeries, but it came from, there's a paper where I think it was by Schwartz in like 2006. So we'll link it, Chris, if that works, so that people can actually read this. But and it was just a cadaver study where they were loading the knee with I think it was 50 newtons of compression and putting it through a bunch of cyclical loading, and they were seeing just elongation and basically what they would say is a failure of the repair. The way they define these terms in the research is what they're looking for is displacement, right? So there's other studies that were showing that if the meniscus displaces by 3 millimeters or more, that was a significant increase in contact surface between the joints. And so you're moving down like this. We're trying to restore hoop tension and the ability to distribute force. And if that meniscus extrudes or if it displaces by 3 millimeters, you were losing that effect. So it was a pretty small window. I mean, if you think about with the ACLs, it's similar, where 3 millimeters or less is kind of what we're looking for a side-to-side increase in laxity. And if you start getting 4 millimeters or 5 millimeters, you start wondering if it's actually doing a whole lot. So there was these cadaver studies that they did where they just kind of loaded the knee up and they just flexed it under load 1,000 times and they measured displacement. And that made sense from a classic cadaver type loading model, but the ability to apply that to human beings was pretty low. Like it wasn't compelling enough for me. So then I had to chase it down a little bit more. Then you saw all these other studies that were all typically mechanical studies. So they were testing different types of suture. I mean, because again, this is like in the infancy of, in the orthopedic world, we've only been doing it for a couple of decades, a decade and a half really is when it's become real popular. So everybody was testing like what sutures are better and transtibial fixations and all these different types of things. And they all use the same protocol. So the entire premise on weight bearing comes from this one paper that was using this type of a loading scheme. And this loading scheme allegedly was supposed to replicate what happened with early postoperative rehab. So of course, that's like a pretty heavy term. So I was like, okay, we got to go figure out how are they saying that this replicates what a week in early postoperative rehab looks like. And you never find it, right? All you find is a paper on how much, joint force there is with walking and squatting and things like that. Or they would borrow from, an unpublished paper from like 1973 on ACL rehab that someone said that this replicates, early ACL rehab. So again, I couldn't find anything that really said the amount of like weight bearing that we were doing actually correlated with any of these studies. Like, I don't think we've even established that very well. So I felt confident that the current body of research that we have does not support, the weight bearing precautions in and of itself. I mean, it doesn't mean that they're wrong. It just means that we are taking cadavers and we're loading them. And then we're saying that this is what's happening in the real world, right? I mean, they remove the ACL from all these cadavers. And we know there's other studies that I talked about in that paper that when you have an intact ACL, that unloads the meniscus, right? Then you take out co-contraction and you take out all these other things. And the reality was that I felt confident that, probably the first week being pretty protective. So I was pretty non-weight bearing, maybe real light toe touch for the first week, right? And then the second week was toe touch. And I really ran kind of a toe touch or maybe even a little bit more than a toe touch, foot flat weight bearing, but pretty minimal, unloading for the first couple of weeks, just because even though I don't feel like the research was compelling, I didn't feel confident that it was, established that it wasn't accurate or relevant or right. Whereas the hip scopes, I think we did a pretty good job of demonstrating that. So that was kind of where we landed. So that's what started this whole process on, weight bearing. And I kind of landed more in the middle between my surgeon and these really like conservative guys. Right. So I don't know if that answered that question very well, but
that did. And you mentioned that both the medial and the lateral meniscal roots were torn and they were both repaired. Is that correct?
Correct. So the difference between the two, 80% of medial meniscus root tears are in, the sedentary over 60 overweight folks, right? They're typically degenerative tears. So 80% of them are in that population, which again, you look at outcomes and you look at some of these things. I mean, I just don't know if it correlates well with younger, healthier, more active type people, right? So that population, then the lateral root tear is in more of the athletic population, right? So ACL insufficiency, but typically going to be your classic type of ACL injury. So those were the two populations that you were typically seeing. So having both, who knows? One could have been degenerative from being ACL, deficient for a long time. I don't think even my surgeon was like, I can't tell if this is like new or if you already had that. But the way that most surgeons are fixing, there's two different types of fixation approaches. The gold standard typically right now is called a transtibial repair, which is where they drill a tunnel through your tibia, right? They anchor that meniscus root, and then you have kind of an endo. They fixate it on the tibia like endo button, like they do on the femur for ACLs. So I ended up having, because I had the surprise lateral meniscus root tear, I ended up having 3 transtibial tunnels, which means I drilled, all the way through my tibia 3 times. And one of the issues, you have to have a good surgeon for these, because on the medial meniscus root and the ACL, those tunnels are so close together that they have to be really careful they don't get tunnel convergence, right? So having a good surgeon that felt confident with that was really important. So I ended up having 3, which is, I think, the most you can have. So,
And there's these first few weeks where you're slowly introducing weight bearing and load into the leg as you're progressing in this acute phase. Are you on range of motion restrictions? Are you stopping at 90 degrees? Are you able to do any range of motion work during these first few weeks?
yeah. So like everybody, I mean, I was tracking extension. I was really trying to get the knee to quiet down. I had a lot more post-operative pain than I was expecting, so I figured, cadaver graft, and I just think I wasn't just tracking maybe, the amount of bone work but I was thinking cadaver graft and meniscus repair, it's not gonna be too bad. I was in pretty rough shape for that especially those first 3 or 4 days. And then even that first week or so, I mean, I was taking pain medication as prescribed, which I thought I was definitely going to be, on the other end, be like, not too bad. I was going to have this like, real speedy kind of bounce back. So my focus was trying to get my pain down, to try to get off the opiates, try to get swelling down and get my extension. So I didn't really even worry about flexion those first probably 2 weeks. Those were my main goals. So I ran, muscle stim was pretty much all I could do, because my restrictions were pretty much the weight bearing side, right? So, toe touch or, for those first 2 weeks, and then weight bearers tolerated, but I couldn't weight bearers tolerated really anyway. Like the pain was pretty significant. I was getting a lot of swelling, when I would try to weight bear too much. So, my actual restriction was a 90-degree flexion restriction for the first 6 weeks. So you'll see some variations on that, where guys will be 90 degrees for the first maybe 4 weeks or even 3 weeks on the earlier side, and then they can progress kind of unloaded flexion as tolerated. But that's pretty typical. Is you're going to see the 90-degree flexion restriction from 4 to 6 weeks. So I really didn't worry about flexion a ton. I wasn't pushing it very much. I felt confident that I would get my flexion back. I was really trying to manage those other things out of the gates.
And is that similar if it was not a meniscal root repair, if it was another type of meniscal repair along with an ACL reconstruction? Would those be general similar guidelines or timelines for range of motion precautions and the weight bearing?
Yeah, and I mean, to be honest, when I reflect back on like the difference of my knowledge base now compared to before I fell off a ladder, I think I treated meniscus root repairs very similarly to meniscus repairs. Like I don't think I separated them out very much in my own mental kind of model. And looking back, I mean, there's some things that definitely are different. So I think it's really common to see that 90-degree restriction, and it's common to see the weight bearing restrictions, and those come from that that axial loading and femoral tibial compression. It pushes out on the meniscus, right? So they're worried about that compromising the repair. And again, depending on the research you read, some of it they think can come from elongation of the sutures, right? So you're elongating the sutures. So there's just some of them are suture pullout, right? So a lot of the researchers, they're seeing that the suture actually pulls through that meniscus material. But again, these are in cadaver folks. I just don't know what that looks like for healthier, more athletic individuals. But yes, those restrictions are pretty similar. The trade-off is, if a classic meniscus repair fails, like I don't know if you're dealing with the same biomechanical consequences that you might be if a meniscus root repair. And that's really where I got hung up on mentally a lot, right? Was I would get a lot of like medial joint pain when I would kind of weight bear, and push my weight bearing a little bit. And then your first thought's like, oh God, I hope I'm not like pulling this out. I hope I'm not like just displacing my meniscus. So yeah, they're similar precautions, but the mental side of it is a little different. We can talk about it a little bit more too as we go, but there are a couple other little things that are different, for the root repairs versus your classic meniscus repairs.
Yeah. So now that you post Jon falling off the ladder, have this information, if you have patients in the future where it's a meniscal root repair and you're managing it, and let's say a surgeon's giving maybe on the more aggressive or quicker end of weight bearing precautions, and what you know now, would you be comfortable with that? Would you want to be a little bit more conservative or in the middle? How would that change?
Yeah, so I think I landed more in the middle, only because the same reason that most of these guys do things is because they're just going to be protected. They don't know, right? But they'd rather just be cautious because, why not, right? You don't have anything to lose. Now, the trade off on that is that, like the non weight bearing guys, I mean, there are significant risks from running somebody in a totally unloaded, knee for 6 weeks, right? So, and some of those things take a really long time to offset in the rehab process. So, I think for us, I put it in the end of that paper, kind of where our meniscus repair kind of lands, our protocol. And this would be something I would default to the surgeon. If he wanted to be conservative, like I'm not going to, not be. So, fun fact, I'm actually an expert witness for a PT negligence case, right? Malpractice. And ultimately, if the surgeon's telling you not to, he says non-weight bearing and you decide to go weight bearing, I mean, you're acting outside of the surgeon recommendations. We can, now the defense will have to say like the surgeon doesn't know, and we can make that argument. But I generally encourage people to stick to the more conservative side. If the surgeon says this is what you should do, then at least, unless you have a relationship with him where you can have those types of conversations, the surgeons in town here would probably let me drive that boat. They would let me make those decisions. On the other side, I don't think I would be aggressive, like with the hip arthroscopy stuff, where I kind of go based on how their symptoms and how they're feeling. So where we kind of landed was non weight bearing for the first week, and then toe touch weight bearing for the next, I think we did 3 weeks, and then it's kind of weight bearing as tolerated from there, and the brace kind of get unload or unlocks, maybe for like weeks 5 and 6. So it's still it's more in the middle, and that makes the most sense to me. You're kind of offsetting the risks and the from totally non weight bearing, but also maybe if you're too aggressive on the weight bearing in the beginning and potentially could compromise that repair, then that's where we kind of landed.
You personally weren't concerned about regaining flexion, so those first few weeks you really prioritized swelling management, pain reduction, regaining extension, waking up the quad to what you could. When you did reintroduce bending the knee and flexion, how did that go?
Surprisingly, it went fine. So like there were certain things, like even as a PT, you have your expectations on how that whole process is going to look, right? Like my ego was enough. I've always had large muscular legs. So I literally thought like I'm not going to lose that much muscle mass. You know what I mean? Like it's genetics. Like I've always had these big legs, and I have a puny leg. You know what I mean? Like it's really hard to stop that, and I had to kind of let go of some of those things. So I was surprised at how much muscle mass I lost, even though I'm predisposed to maintain it, and from genetics and training history, and because I know what I'm looking for, and I ran a pretty consistent and aggressive muscle stim protocol. So I was doing maybe twice a day, running 20 minutes of kind of high effort quad sets, and still, so I got my quad back pretty quick. It was more challenging for me to get a heel pop, which is our criteria for getting off of crutches, is that you have to be able to flex your quad such that the back of your knee is touching the table and your heel can come off of the table, even if it's just, a quarter inch. So that took me longer than I expected to get back, because I felt like I could get a pretty good quad contraction. Like visually, you could see a good quad contraction. I felt like I had pretty good passive extension. I would do a heel prop for 10 minutes. I felt like I had good extension, but pulling those two things together took me longer than I thought it would. I mean, I think it probably took me almost 7 weeks, maybe, maybe even a little bit longer. I was really close for a while, but it probably took me over 7 weeks to be able to get a heel pop. So that took longer. I lost more muscle mass than I thought. And obviously that early postoperative pain was way higher than what I was tracking. On the knee flexion side, I wasn't really prioritizing it, and it's coming pretty easy. And I think that is probably related. I think if people, we push the flexion a lot, and they're just irritated and pinching, and it just doesn't feel very good. So I just kind of let it come as it came, and just I worked on it, but it wasn't something super aggressive, and it really wasn't a priority for me. Even now, it's not a priority for me. I mean, I really feel like I don't see many people on my own, experience that really don't get their flexion back. It might be slow, but it's just not something that I feel like we have to work as hard for compared to some of the other things, right? Like getting their knee torque back or getting their extension back early. So yeah, it came pretty. It is coming smoothly. I think I have about 120 degrees. So we didn't talk about that. I'm about 9 weeks out from surgery. So yeah, I'm about 120 degrees. I think I've lost about 1.5 centimeters of quad mass, and I'm still dealing with pain and swelling, but definitely moving in the right direction.
At what point did you start introducing some loading to the non-surgical leg and the upper body and conditioning? And what did that look like when you did start it?
Yeah. So I had a good maybe 2 weeks, maybe a week and a half, like just pity party where I just sat on the couch. I read like 4 books in like 2 weeks. You know what I mean? So I really was just kind of doing the real easy stuff those first like 2 weeks. Like even my son was telling his teachers, he's like, my dad just sits on the couch for like 12 hours a day. And I don't think he ever told them I got hurt. Like, I think they just think I'm like, and Willy Wonka in the chocolate factory, right? The uncle, right? Just sitting on the couch is like a deadbeat. But so yeah, so I started doing some modified upper body stuff about 10 to 14 days after surgery, and real easy, 25-minute, type circuits that I could set up pretty easily. Non-surgical leg, I started probably doing a little bit later, maybe like 4 or 5 weeks. The thing about, when even though we all talk about it and it's something that we really champion with our patients early on, is that, hey, the rest of the body still works. There are some pretty significant obstacles, right? Like I couldn't carry anything. I couldn't like move a dumbbell over, or, I couldn't load a barbell for like some single leg landmine or else. Like I just couldn't carry. I still can't carry more than probably 30 pounds. You know what I mean? It's one of those things that you're not really like tracking. So setup wise is pretty much, machine based training, right? I can do knee extensions. I can do some prone hamstring curls on my non-surgical side, and I can do leg press and maybe some calf raises. And that's like really about it. So I'm sure we could be more creative, but I just minimum dose right now. I gave myself the space to not have to like try to feel like I had to be this like champion, right out of the gates. And probably until this week, I mean, is when I felt more confident that like things have kind of turned that corner a bit. I feel like I can start kind of getting into a little bit more of a traditional type training program.
And then conditioning wise, did you utilize the bike? Did you just get a sick upper body pump? What did that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I like that you think conditioning is high on my list. As for those that don't know, a longtime competitive bodybuilder. Oh my god, power lifter, terrible bodybuilder, pretty good power lifter. So conditioning wasn't super high. I had these ideas, you know what I mean, in my mind that I was going to be like a David Goggins, you know what I mean, coming out of this, and I landed a little bit closer to like Walter Goggins, you know what I mean. So just kind of angry, yeah, a little whiskey. But I do some like, assault, upper body assault bike was about the only thing I could really set up that I could try to get some heart rate stuff going. And to be honest, I've probably done that less than a half a dozen times. You know what I mean? I've been able to start kind of getting on the bike now, and now I can actually start doing a full kind of a 50 cal on the assault bike, nice and easy. But most of my upper body training, it had to be machine based. So I'd go to the gym, and back, I don't know when it was, when I finished competing, so like 2021, 2022, I went through kind of a lull, like I think most people do when they don't have like a specific target, when they're used to training for like a goal. And so I went through this kind of lull, and I'd go to the gym and I would do, 2 or 3 things. I'd be there for like 20, and I'd walk out of there, and I had to like change my mindset, because I'd walk out and be like, that was just like a bullshit workout. Like just kind of mad at myself. And I had to shift the way I thought about things of like, that's one's always more than zero. You know what I mean? I went in, I did 20 minutes worth of work. That's more than doing, 0 minutes. And I let some of those kind of expectations go. And a similar thing, during this process. So like I can't train anywhere near the way I want to train. I don't feel like just physically, I'm starting to kind of get back to it, but I haven't been able to really do anything heavy and hard. And that's the stuff I like to do. So I go to the gym and I have a upper body split, and I just almost, I go probably 5 or 6 days a week because I'll do back and biceps, and then shoulders and chest, and then back and biceps. I can roll through it on a higher frequency, but it's 20 minutes, right? I walk in and say hello to the front desk, and then 20 minutes later I walk out. I'm like, thanks, see you tomorrow. But it's been good for me. It's been good to just be able to go and still feel like I can do some hard stuff, even though it isn't anything like I like to do. And so I think just with our own patients and with myself, it's more of like trying to minimize obstacles. I can't pick up weights. I'll tell my wife, I'm like, can you put that 35-pound kettlebell upstairs and set it by the couch? And so maybe I can do a couple things. So I've been consistently and with a pretty good frequency training upper and lower or upper body on the machines. And then just in the last probably in a little bit of lower body too, when I could finally get into them. Because even with that 90-degree restriction, you can't get into the knee extension very easily, right? You're trying to hold your leg in a weird thing. And so it wasn't super convenient until probably about the 5-week mark. So, but yeah, that's kind of what it looked like. And then, really have just started loading the surgical leg in the last maybe week or so, week and a half. So
Yeah, over the past week and a half, what have you started to introduce on that surgical leg?
yeah, not a lot, so again, I still have I read all this research, and I made a joke on Instagram, it's this battle between, you're telling yourself that like you're not smarter than everyone. Like you haven't solved this, right? All these researchers have done all this work, and you haven't like figured it out. So that's that constant conversation of like, you're not smarter than everyone. And then it's usually followed up by like, well, you might be, so, you might be. So I've landed in the middle. I've been really concerned. I'm not pushing it. A lot of these post-operative protocols, they're wild. Like you'll see some of them that they can't squat to depth for till 6 months, right? And they can start squatting to 70 degrees at 12 weeks. So they're really conservative on squatting. So that kind of freaked me out. Like, you got guys that say you can't squat to depth till 6 months, but like, where did that come from, right? And again, you had to go back to the research. And it's funny about the research, you don't see a significant change in the load on the meniscus root with knee flexion. I think this has been a weird thing that people have been really protective over. Like, if I had to make a decision about where we're missing it, is I don't think the passive range of motion restriction needs to be there. You just don't see anything in the research that's compelling that says that the working into the flexion as tolerated is the issue. Right. What it seems to be is repetitive kind of axial compression could be the bigger problem. Right. So my training itself has been, I do some single leg press work, and I'm typically training mid range. I'm training like 20 to 70 degrees, and I'm running kind of like a fatigue based protocol. So I do 3 rounds of 20 reps, and I really just try to take that last one until I feel like I get, a stimulus there. But I'm not really pushing kind of end range. I'm not really pushing real heavy. I'm doing some knee extensions, which have been by far the most uncomfortable of this whole process. So, which doesn't make any sense to me. If you look like, most people, like even the ACL guys, I'm 9 weeks out. Like, I should be able to do some light knee extensions without a lot of, discomfort. And I can do maybe 10 pounds. It's all patellofemoral, like medial patellofemoral pain. And I don't know if it's just because quad's been tight, or I haven't just been able to load things for so long. Cause we're coming up on over 4 months of me being able to do any kind of effective, loading to that leg. So that's been real nice and easy. Take what it'll give me. And then I've just started kind of getting into more of like secondary type patterns, maybe like some dumbbell pullovers, some, bench press, if somebody will set it up for me. Cause I need a lot of help these days, So if I have some people that are around that can kind of help me out, then I can start getting in like just some close chain loading. But really, I would say I'm doing some heavy banded TKEs, which, historically I don't love for the ACL guys, but I loaded up with a pretty heavy band, and those feel really good. So I can get a stimulus there, and that's about it. Like it's been, I mean, this week I'll probably start getting into some step up type work. I'll probably start getting into like some like mini squat type patterns, and I'll start probably getting some hip hinge stuff. So I've been conservative on the hip hinge too. You look at that, the paper I wrote, but there's this weird like undertone where people talk about like no direct hamstring loading for root repairs, and it comes from the anatomy of the hamstring and its attachment into the capsule. It shares an attachment with that medial root. So though the researchers actually say like we don't actually have anything that shows that if you load that hamstring that it's going to compromise repair, but the concern is that by pulling on that capsule, you're pulling on the meniscus root also, and then that could create some of these like downstream effects on the increased meniscus extrusion or displacement or whatever. So I probably will, because I don't know, I will be more conservative on like direct isotonic type hamstring loading. But it doesn't make sense to me to like not be able to start hip hinging or any of that, right? I mean, that's every time you sit down and every time you do those things, you're already getting some hamstring loading. So that'll probably be with the next like week. Looks like for me.
That heavy banded TKE you've
Mhm.
utilized for yourself. You said you don't like it with your other ACLs. Why did you choose it for yourself, and why don't you like it for ACL post-op?
Yeah, this is likely something that I will change my mind on in the future, and I may even change it from my own process through going through this. But I just don't love that like repetitive 30-degree loading, right? I still have that like old, the old, Kevin Wilk in my brain, just like that 30-degree position is, kind of stresses the repair. So I do typically, I don't know about typically, but I have there's a certain part of me that like if it isn't helpful or we don't need to do it, then I'm not going to just do it just for the sake of doing it. And so for me, the trade off is I brought in knee extensions much earlier than I used to. I mean, I will have people doing isometric, knee extension work as soon as they can get comfortably to 90 degrees, right? So so week 1.5, they're usually running knee extension isometrics, and I will run long arc quads and even loaded knee extensions as soon as they feel comfortable with it. So, but the TKEs, I feel like you get some weird patterns. They're kind of awkward, and then they just end up in that weird kind of angle that I just don't love. Same thing with the calf raise, right? The calf raise is an antagonist to the gastroc is an antagonist to the ACL. So like I don't have guys do calf raises for the first 4 to 6 weeks. I don't know if that's right. Like that might just my own brain. I'm like I know that it does put some stress on the ACL. I know we're getting a lot of stress with a lot of the other things that we're doing. So where I can make adjustments in a way that I think is not going to be counterproductive towards getting to our goals, then I'll usually make some adjustments there. So I may change my mind on that. That's not something I feel entirely confident with, So just my own personal preferences.
Going into the eventual mid stage, late stage, the rest of your own rehab, is there anything that you'll think of doing differently if this was just an isolated ACL or it wasn't a meniscal root repair? Or is most of, once you get out of this early phase, things based off of symptom tolerance and how your body responds? Would it be pretty much equivalent?
Yeah, I mean, it's because of the squatting precaution. I mean, that I don't anticipate. I mean, next week will be 10 weeks, so I don't really even anticipate my squatting getting anywhere near what I would consider to be what I would have somebody else doing for just like classic ACL or something like that. At 12 weeks, I'll be hoping if I'm squatting 26 pounds to a bench, like I'll be pretty stoked. So I feel like there's probably going to be a pretty significant delay on meeting like strength metrics, how uncomfortable the knee extension is at this point. I see that like the knee torque and my like trying to establish like a peak power metric for my knee extension. I could see those being a lot slower than I would have anticipated. Right, I would have expected that I was putting out some like really impressive numbers at this point, just because of what we do and my history and all that stuff. So I don't. I've kind of moved away from like for my own current person a timeline based goal. I'm just going to kind of move through things as they come. I have one of my other PTs. He's our clinic director for this location. He's going to be kind of running point on the rehab. The first 8 weeks, I did it just because I was kind of just so close to it, and I was making so many adjustments based off what I was kind of reading in the research. But he'll be running point on my program so that because you need that. You need someone to tell you like, hey, have you tried this yet? Like, no, I haven't. maybe it's my own preference, or it just wasn't on, I wasn't tracking it. So he'll run that. So yeah, so I'm going to take things as they come. I'm shifting a lot of the, responsibility for my programming to one of my other PTs, and mid-range end game stuff. I don't know if I'm going to be the guy that needs to go through like an unanticipated skill block, right? I don't know if I need to juke anybody. I do want to feel confident that I can move quickly, right? That I can do some athletic base. I need to be able to demonstrate those things again in the clinic. So I likely will pursue this through our kind of anticipated skill work. I'll make sure that I can do all those things. I can do them well because I know I have to be able to show them. But I don't know if I'll end up, I'll be a statistic, right? I won't end up finishing that last like 10% because it isn't relevant to my goals. And this is the same thing that if I have guys right now, I mean, if they're a CrossFitter, I don't know if I'm going to put them through the same kind of end phase type programming, right? Or if the things that they like to do. So if they're D1 athletes, I got to, cut, tackle, that kind of stuff for sure. But I've been willing to concede a lot more on what that last phase looks like for ACL guys. And I imagine I'll be in the same camp.
How has it been? Sounds like you haven't missed much of patient care, maybe the first few weeks post-operatively. But how's it been managing patients as a clinician going through this process?
Yeah. There's been some it's hard, right? I mean, I have the benefit that I can set my schedule, right? I can do whatever I want. So yeah, I took about a week and a half off, and then I came back just doing mornings. So I just worked from like 7 to noon, and that was perfect. I mean, that's all I could handle, and I did that for a month. So I had 4 weeks where I could work for from 7 to noon with patient care, and then I had the afternoons to kind of do more of my admin stuff, and that really gave me a nice base. I was because that was all. I mean, my knee would swell, and I would be sore, and it'd be pretty rough, for those first maybe at least those first 2 weeks, and then I just went back to my normal schedule, which is 7 to 6 on 2 days a week, and then a half day on Fridays. And I just started that at the beginning of this month. So that's been about 3 weeks. And that first week I was still on a crutch. I was still on a brace, and I was kind of working through, the obstacles of doing that. But I had a dedicated, tech that would kind of help me out because I can't pick up weights, and they still have to demonstrate, 90% of the stuff that I show. So I have a lot of resources available to me, and that's not lost on me that, this is about as, smooth as you could draw it up because of those things. The hard part is being in pain and the other things that come along with, an injury of just not being able to do the things you enjoy. Like I can't help out with my kids as much, all those things that kind of weigh on you. Your ability to be fully present for a patient is challenging. You're just, when you're in fully present for anybody, but you're in pain and you're dealing with the rest of frustrations of the things that you want to do. So I had to really kind of focus on making sure that when I had especially new evaluations, right? New patients that had not met me, that I just double down, get in the mirror and slap myself in the face a couple times and go out there and be the person that they need me to be. So that was a very conscious effort. I was very aware that I didn't have a whole lot, in the cup. So that was only really for the first couple of weeks, and that's gotten a lot better. The trade-offs though, that were really positive, I think, that I wasn't anticipating is that one, your empathy is through the roof, right? When you're on crutches and you're in a brace, it's a bad look for a marketing standpoint, right? We're like, hey, come on back, and we both crutch back to the table. But I think I was able to build a connectiveness to patients a lot quicker and a lot easier when they saw that I was also going through a similar experience as them. I think it gave me an opportunity to show better coping skills. So when people would ask me how it's going, I was able to kind of show them how you want someone to respond. It's not bad. It's not great. I wish it was better. I thought, some things were going to be a little bit better than they were at this point, but it's getting better every week. And I tell them last week I could only walk without a crutch for 3 hours. Today I did 5. Those are wins. And I can use those examples to get people to kind of focus on the small wins. And I think that I've done a good job of being able to celebrate small wins, and I've done a pretty good job of kind of, compartmentalizing and managing the identity type stuff of not being able to do the things I want to do and not, be able to train the way I want. And then the fear of, is this going to be okay? Right. Because that is a fear with this type of surgery, is that if this fails, what are my options? Right. If the ACL repair fails, whatever, I didn't want it to begin with, so I've been managing those types of things, I think, generally pretty well, but it allows me to have more meaningful conversations with my patients. And that was something that I was not really expecting. So yeah, so it's been a mixed bag for sure.
Yeah, you had mentioned earlier of that typical spiel that a lot of clinicians will give about providing the optimism of during this early period, we can still take advantage of the rest of the body, but you coming to the realization that trying to train productively and hard for other areas of your body is just hard with the logistics of
Mhm.
managing that setup by yourself. Does that, or have any of these other things kind of changed maybe your narrative or thoughts with managing any of the other rehab process just as you go through it with patients now?
For sure. You know what I mean? Like it's real easy for us to be like, well, 90% of the body's fine. Like, yeah, it is, but I can't carry anything from A to B. So, so I think like just being a little bit, a little refresher on how significant those obstacles can be for folks. I also think like it's important to allow people to have some space for the pity party, right? Like this sucks. Like give yourself, a few weeks, give yourself a month just to, be frustrated, upset. And then we got to start getting back to it. You know what I mean? So, and that's kind of, it took me a little bit longer to get there, but like that's where I'm at. I mean, I'm done with like, it's time to like start actually maybe like paying attention to my nutrition. You know what I mean? Like start prioritizing some things that I really, you can't have beer every day. You know what I mean? You got to like let it go, and you got to get back to, the real world, because, the pants aren't fitting as well, and those things are, so I've allowed a little bit more space for people to kind of go through that kind of grieving process of being injured, and it's okay for them to not be super motivated these first 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 weeks, but then at some point we do have to kind of get back to it. So been a little bit more lenient, and or a little bit more understanding on that side for sure with folks. And then also being able to just kind of share my own experiences and the things that I've struggled with, and the things that I've been able to kind of that have helped me, right? Celebrating small wins being obviously the biggest one. So yeah, so it's just interesting when you go through that process yourself of how you think it's going to be, and when reality comes in, like kind of how you manage. So it's really been a positive overall, I would say, which sounds weird, right? It's been a positive experience for me, because I mean the understanding that I have on meniscus root repairs is 10x what it was 4 months ago. You know what I mean? This is now something that I feel like I have a very high level of understanding on the meniscus root repair literature, the rehab decision making, the experience that people are going through, and I don't think I could say that with supreme confidence 6 months ago. So that's a benefit. I've had a refresher on empathy and just going through what a patient is going through. So I think it's I lost my mom early in life, and I think when you lose a parent, everybody always wants to, not to take this down like a dark road, but everybody wants to give you condolences, and the first thing you think in your head when someone tries to give you condolences is, well, you still have your parents. Like, what do you know? And only the people that had been through what you had been through were able to be the ones that gave you, like, that space, or gave you that I don't know what the word is, compassion that you would listen to. I mean, I ended up being in this weird corner of my friendships where when people lost a parent, I was the only one that they could talk to. And so going through, obviously in a less, dark, intense deal, but in a similar fashion as right now, I think when I have conversations with people, they're not in their head being like, what do you know? You know what I mean? Like, you're fine. You can get around. You can play with your kids. So I've been able to connect, on a deeper level. So overall, it's been, I think, a positive experience, and it's definitely like shaped some of my own relationships and my own, understandings. And it still sucks, and I'm still not stoked about the fact that 6 months from now, I mean, I still may not be doing the stuff I want to do, and that's just stuff I have to cope with.
That was great. Anything else, Jon, that you want to touch on, either with the deep dive on the meniscal root research that you looked into, or just your own general reflections on this rehab, or kind of thoughts for people that may have to go through it themselves as a clinician managing this?
I mean, I think we've talked about it in the past, and on some of the other podcasts, but like, you have to take your weaknesses and make them strengths. You know what I mean? The things that you don't feel like you understand well, I think it's really important to pick one or two of those and make it a strength. And I think that's what happened with this. I mean, I feel like now meniscus root rehab is one of my strengths, and so I always encourage people to kind of reflect on where their confidence is within their own kind of management. Which cases do they feel like they don't know enough about, or they feel uncomfortable with? And because all we do is just follow whatever the doc says, right? And so I always encourage people to kind of try to find a way to make weaknesses their strengths. Ideally, not from going through the surgical process themselves. But and within the, specifically to the meniscus root repairs, I think the middle ground. I mean, we want to maintain as much strength as possible, but we do have to respect that there are some concerns about progressive cyclical weight bearing loading early on. We don't know how much is good, and we don't know how much is too much. And I think that they need to either have a conversation with the surgeon or they need to do some research themselves. But you want to get comfortable with those progressions. Even my guy who was non-weight bearing for 6 weeks, he could start doing some leg press. And he was self-selecting on weight that was way heavier than what I felt comfortable with. Even though it felt fine, he's like, feels good. His kid's like 17. It's like, feels good. I'm like, I'm just going to back it down, man. Like, I just want to be more conservative because I don't know if like putting a lot of repetitive flexion loading at this point, and we're like talking week 7, right? I mean, he's been non-weight bearing and now everything feels great. And so I was able to kind of make some of those decisions where I'm pulling people back a little bit, even though it feels good, because I'm respecting that a lot of the research does support that repetitive, flexion under load can cause, some of these complications with the repair. I just don't know if it's as like clear cut, and I don't know if it's as dramatic as what we see in the biomechanical research. So, and the hamstring loading, like I'm not going to do it only because I don't have anything that really supports that it's fine. And so for me, does it matter that much in the scheme of things if I push out direct hamstring loading to week 10 versus week 8? It doesn't. And so like that's where a lot of my decision making has been, is I'm willing to push it out a couple weeks because I'm not sure. And I think we get stuck where if we're not sure, we don't do it at all, or we just totally disregard recommendations and we just kind of go as tolerated. And this is just an interesting one where I think people got to pay a little bit more attention. I don't think it's something you have to be like, hyper vigilant about, but it's a more interesting rehab than maybe some of the other things that I've experienced.
I think that some of that was a similar theme to you discussing the hip arthroscopy, like early post-op, some of your reflections when you dove into some of the research and how you've changed your own practice of like that first phase, just being more chill and letting things calm down. And in some sense, this meniscal root is that in addition to just the concern about what could happen if are too aggressive. But I think that can be a similar theme to a lot of these post-op cases where it's a rotator cuff repair, hip arthroscopy, ACL, meniscal root, like ligamentous, meniscal, tendinous, just allowing things to chill for a few weeks or not feeling so neurotic about having to jump straight into it, because a lot of these are just really long rehabs. And like you said, is there a major difference between jump starting this XYZ part of the process at week 8 versus week 12 or week 4 versus week 6? And obviously there are these immediate priorities that should be occurring, but a lot of that is letting things calm down and chill and not doing too much too soon.
Yeah, exactly. I think we've gone through in the last, maybe 7 or 8 years with, with social media and everything was, just got to load it. And everyone had to like peacock on how much they were loading somebody, online. And I think we're seeing that swing back where I think we're doing too much in the vast majority of cases. I think PTs, we have a tendency just to feel like we have to kind of do all these different things. And the reality is like a lot of people like less is more, especially in the beginning. I mean, the irony of I do my PT workout twice a week and it takes me 20 minutes. Like I work on some motion. I make sure I'm working on like the bigger arching things of trying to manage my workload and manage swelling. But I mean, it's maybe 3 times a week at the most, but I'm not like hitting range of motion, all the things that how we draw it up in our head. And it's actually, I think, been the thing that's helped me the most, right? Is not having this like looming, constant, thing over my head. And 3 times a week, I do some leg press, I do some, some heel slides, and I do my little workout, and things are getting better. And in the last week and a half, things have really like turned a corner, and I'm actually feeling the best I felt in this whole process just this last week. If I felt like I was just hammering on it all the time and trying to hit these like certain kind of goals, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know if I would have had that same positive or I would have been more frustrated, right? You see those folks that come in and we measure their flexion every single time. And if they didn't improve, like, it's just like, it ruins their entire day. So less is definitely more, and meeting people where they're at. If people, those A-type personalities that need to train in, the upper body, then give it, or the opposite leg, whatever it is, then yeah, giving them some tools. And if there's other folks that just are having a rough go, It's okay if they can just chill. I had genuine concerns that I was getting bed sores. Like I would have to shift because my ischial tuberosities were hurting because of how much I was sitting on the couch. Like I was like, I have to like lay down a little bit to unload my ischial tuberosity because I am just. I mean, I took it really easy. My wife is a saint. Like she did all the things for that first month, and so I really just gave myself the space to just kind of let things calm down and heal. And I obviously, have a lot of resources to help that. But yeah, we're stuck in this pattern where I feel like we have to do more. And I think most people probably need to do less. So yeah, I agree.
All right, Jon, we'll call it there. For people that want to learn more or follow you through this, you've, as of right now, been tracking a lot of your steps along the way on the Nev PT Instagram. So I'll put that in the show notes. By the time this episode comes out, it may or may not have already been published, your not so definitive guide to meniscal root repairs. So people can read that, or we'll retroactively upload that to the show notes and our prior conversation as well. But Jon, I appreciate you coming on and sharing your own personal story, some of the comedic elements, but also just some of the realities and so much that you've learned throughout this process. This has been awesome. Thanks again.
Yeah, buddy. I always appreciate you having me.